Hi, YouTube, BookTube, whichever community I may or may not be speaking to. It's been a while since I've made a video, but since I did a lot of videos about my experience reading slash rereading Brian Jacques' Redwall series, as with some of my series in the past, I thought it would be fun to rank all the books at the end. Now, these are the rankings of someone who has not read these books a ton of times. I doubt there are that many people who've read them all a ton of times, so obviously it is far from an exact science. But I guess the closer we get to the top of the list, the more meaningful it's going to get, because of course, if I really loved a book, it's going to be near the top, and maybe you should give it a read yourself. So, number 22 on my list is The Rogue Crew, also the 22nd and final book in the series. And it's basically the pinnacle of a quality I don't like in the Redwall series, in that it thinks simply giving us a bunch of badass characters, in this case otters and hares, is a substitute for having adequate character development. I felt like as the series progressed, Brian Jacques more and more leaned towards the, young boy who likes his action figure side of him rather than the young boy, girl, etc., who likes storytelling side of him. Number 21 on my list, maybe a bit of a controversial choice, is The Long Patrol. So I doubt objectively this is the second worst book in the series, but this is the one where disappointment hit me the hardest. So basically, my critique of this one is the same as my critique of The Rogue Crew, that it substitutes good storytelling for just giving us a bunch of badasses. But the difference with this one is the first half of the book was really good. It started with this kind of unique scene of this young hare fantasizing about being a soldier and having to overcome his dismissive, strict father and secretly having this supportive mother. Like, it was a very unique atmosphere. You don't usually see full families like that in the Redwall universe. But in the second half of the book, it seems like Brian Jacques just forgets that he had a main character at all. It's easy to miss that hair, Tamo, and all the chaos that's going on. Someone who really liked this book explained to one of my comments that it's the most epic sized battle in the Redwall universe. So if that's your thing, that's your thing. But yeah, this felt like the most extreme example of disappointment for me. Number 20 on my list is Eulalia. I found this one more enjoyable than the previous two books on my list. But as a friend in my Redwall online reading group who went by the name Barone said, this book is basically Redwall by numbers. Its characters, particularly Maudie the Hare, feel like lesser imitations of characters we've seen already in the series. Towards the end of the book, there is something a bit unique in that it tries to reflect on the Badger concept of blood wrath and how its particular main character developed this tendency towards violent, vengeful battling, but it's really too little, too late. Number 19 on my list is Hyrule Lane. And this one, kind of like Long Patrol, gets a low ranking in that it has the ingredients to really be a unique entry in the series, but then it just totally runs out of steam, and you notice it as it runs out of steam. At its best, this book tries to create a unifying mythology for the otters, one of the species in the series that have not received that treatment so far. I also really like the variant of the hare character in this series. He's a uniquely tragic figure. But, like a lot of Redwall books, this one has a lot going on and it doesn't really know how to resolve it all. It just sort of resolves in battle happening and good triumphing over evil. Number 18 on my list is Loam Hedge. And maybe I should have ranked this one below Pyrulane, to be honest. I don't know, I just have a soft spot for this one just because I really like this character in it named Flinky. I actually remembered him as a kind of minor character when I read the book as a child, but when I reread it this time, I'm like, wow, no, Flinky's actually a big part of this book, which, lifts it up a point or two in my rankings. But kind of like The Long Patrol and Hyrule Lane, there's an anticlimacticism to this one in that it refers back to this important part of Redwall's past, Loam Hedge Abbey, but it ultimately doesn't really feel like it's building on the classic books of the series. It's just another standalone late entry, kind of repetitive uh, entry in the series. Number 17 on my list, I have The Sable Queen. So this, I guess, is the top of the bottom tier. It took a really long time for me to get into this one, but I felt it kind of made up for being a kind of rambly beginning by having a very strong conclusion. So the Sable Queen for a title villain is in the background a lot at the beginning of the book, but her craftiness and unique villain voice really comes out towards the end. I also like how there's this plot that's established at the very beginning of the book that Brian Jacques seems to forget about, and then that suddenly shows up at the end. It's a very satisfying moment where you realize, oh, sometimes Brian does really focus on plot development and themes, even if it seems like he's not interested in that stuff. There's also a very weird little hedgehog detail in this one, so I like that. So now to my middle tier, I'm next gonna go with a fairly classic one in The Bellmaker. So as with Loamhedge, this book does have a bit of a soft spot in my heart because of one of its subplots. I'm sure you can guess it's the one with Blaggett. I also really like the arc of Roofbrush the Squirrel in this book, who is a memorable but relatively minor character in the book Mariel of Redwall. So getting to hear a significant part of the book from his perspective is quite satisfying. But outside of that, this book, the seventh in the series, is the beginning of that sort of negative development in Brian Jakes's writing, that really came out in books like The Long Patrol and The Rogue Crew, where he's more interested in just having these cool otters around and not really interested in building on characters and themes. I wanted to hear more about the Bellmaker, but instead we just got a ton about Finbar the Otter. Number 15 on my list is Moral Fox. So this forms very loosely a series with the Long Patrol and the Tagarung. And I think with all three of those books, there's something satisfying in how they're connected through the character of Crega. And I guess with Long Patrol, it's also connected to the past through the character of Tansy. So there's kind of a whole is greater than the sum of the parts thing with these, where the fact that they're all connected makes them all feel special. But as individual books, they all have their weaknesses. So when it comes to Moral Fox, on the one hand, it's kind of disappointing in that you supposedly have these magical villains, this one of a kind species. They're not quite normal foxes, they're moral foxes. And Brian doesn't quite commit to that bit. In the end, they don't seem any different than any other Redwall villains. But however disappointed one is with the moral foxes, there's something just pleasant about the main characters, Song, Danflor, and Dippler. Even as they aren't that different from the various traveling groups of heroes we've seen before, there's something uniquely relatable about them in that they're young and kind of intermediate in their skills. They don't jump from zero to hero in the way a character like Matthias does. No, they feel more like Harry, Ron, and Hermione in that, they're developing on their way to be heroes. Number 14 on my list is Matameo. And the big problem with this book is that it's too darn long. Its opening is amazing. It sets it up to make you think it's going to be a really distinct book in the series. Slagar is unlike any other Redwall villain in that, spoiler alert, he's pretty much the only Redwall villain to have appeared in another book. But again, like a lot of the books on the list, it just gets overwhelmed with characters, and the more interesting thematic details just get overwhelmed by a lot of action happening and detail happening, and it's just not quite the right balance for me. Number 13 on my list is Doom White. So I like this one a bit more than some of the other late books in the series. In written order, this is 20 out of 22, but it just had some uniquely creepy imagery in there, including a uniquely unpleasant shrew log-a-log, the chief of the shrews. Another great example of a weird scene with a hedgehog. And I like that its cast of young heroes, it didn't make any one of them a superstar. Again, as I was saying with Moral Fox, they all kind of felt like young students who show flashes of brilliance, but also still seem young and relatable. Number 12 on my list, I have The Legend of Luke. And as I said in my video on this one, parts 1 and 3 basically feel like a Disney direct-to-video sequel, but part 2 of the book is a tightly told tale of revenge with a uniquely dark ending, even as there already is a lot of darkness and tragedy in the Redwall universe. And it completes the trilogy of Martin the Warrior, making him a uniquely deep character in the Redwall series. Next on my list is the Tagarung. So, like Matameo, this book is a bit too darn long for its own good. Also, messaging wise, it's really questionable. I know Outcast of Redwall gets criticized a lot for suggesting nature over nurture. Some people are just born bad. But I think this one is worse than Outcast of Redwall in that it's less nuanced. This otter character who's raised by villains, there's sort of no question. He just turns out good because he's an otter and otters are the good ones. Like, it wastes its potential to be a really interesting book. Despite this, and despite the fact that I don't care much for the secondary protagonist, Nimbolo the Slayer, this is one of the best villain plots in the series, and that's what boosts it up on the list. There's a twist in terms of who the main villain is, and the fact that the main villain isn't really worthy of being a main villain, and there's this kind of macabre but slapstick way in which his little army falls apart. I think that part of the book is really strong. Number 10 on my list, I have Raketitam. This one, I guess, is unique in that A, it's fairly constrained with how many main characters it has. So rather than just having a bunch of tough guys and you forget them all, each character kind of has a unique personality and you know why they're in the story. And it also has this unique folktale feel in that it's centered around this mysterious object called the Walking Stone, and there's a witty clarification as to what the Walking Stone is. I think both times I read this one, I really enjoyed it. Number 9 on my list is Triss, and this book was just fun to read. Well, for many it signifies the true descent of the series into repetitiveness. There was something about this one that was just a bit more cartoonish than the other books, particularly the villains, despite being animals in the non real world, had German accents. There was just a lot of whimsy with this one. Darkness, but a lot of whimsy as well. Number 8 on my list is The Pearls of Lutra. So for me, this book served as a kind of midway point in Brian Jakes's writing career. And a lot of this book, a lot of what I enjoyed about it was him kind of reflecting back on the series of Redwall and noticing what had changed. For example, in the early books of Redwall, there was a reference to a church called St. Ninian's. And when this book comes along, Brian Jakes realizes, why the heck is there a church in this fully secular universe where there is no human existence? Another really strong point in this book is Romska, one of the few truly gray characters in the series. Uh, and aesthetically, it's kind of cool to picture. There's this mysterious island populated by monitor lizards. There was also some things I didn't like on this book, which is why it's not quite top tier for me. I felt the villain, despite having a kind of whimsical name, didn't do very much for me. I very much disliked the secondary villain for Sconza. I felt that was a wasted opportunity. And I didn't really fall in love with any of the main heroes either. So with Pearls of Lutra, it's a book that has a lot going on, a lot I liked, a lot I was only kind of meh with. Number 7 on my list is Lord Brocktree. So I guess now we're really getting into the top tier. So Redwall's hares are beloved because they are most often the comic relief in this book. And this book centers the series' most complete hare character, which is Dottie. Normally the hares, yeah, they're a little bit funny, but the joke is the same every time. And when it comes to fighting, they're the most super competent warriors you're ever going to see. But what's great with Dottie is that she kind of takes that hare goofiness to the next level. And even though she means well and she's able to accomplish quite a lot, there are a lot of moments where she is truly awkward to be around, a bit of a hindrance to the badger hero, Lord Brocktree. As I said in my video on this topic, there's a kind of low-key Shrek and Donkey feel to their pairing. I really liked the character of Ripfang as the book's side villain, which kind of made this book a prequel to Mossflower, even though Brian Jakes weirdly denies that it is. A lot of fun side characters, including Bucko Big Bones. The one real flaw with this one is it aspires to be the prequel of the series, the very beginning of Badger lore and Salamandastron. But then Brian Jakes can't imagine a beginning, so Brocktree is not the first badger. Dottie is not the first hare to work with a badger. Brocktree is succeeding his father, who also has an army of hares. I don't know, it doesn't quite work conceptually, but I think it's still a very well written book. Number 6 on my list, we have Mariel of Redwall. So, if you read the books in publishing order, so for the early books in the series, Brian Jacques didn't write them in the order they took place in the series' internal history, so people distinguish between publishing and chronological order. But anyway, if you read the books in publishing order, I find the prose of this one really stands out. This world just seems a little richer. The characters are a bit more nuanced. I remember really liking Gabul as a villain. I mean, he's a terrible character morally, but yeah, there was something about his charisma that really popped off the page. It reminded me of the characterization of sort of a real world tyrant descending into chaos. Uh, Another unique feature of this book is that the main hero uses a rope as a weapon rather than a sword, and it just gives her a kind of unique chutzpah. They also handle the hairs really well. You know, rather than having one goofball hair or one super disciplined soldier hair, you have this trio, and you're able to tell this unique story of military valor. Number 5 on my list is Mossflower. So this book includes a good ensemble of characters. It's a big cast, but it's not an unmanageable one, as I found with some of the later books like The Bellmaker. I also like that this book kind of features all of the species from the Redwall universe, giving it a good balance. He doesn't overdo it with otters or hares or whoever as he may do in other books. But I think what's really strong about Mossflower is the unique quest it's centered around. Even though it's the first book about Martin the Warrior, the famed hero of all the Redwall series, Martin's quest is to find this far more powerful warrior in Bor the Fighter because Martin does not see himself as worthy of saving Mossflower. And the plot twist this book takes on is really unique. Number 4 on my list, this one's pretty high up, and it's going to surprise a lot of people because a lot of people consider this the worst book in the series. I'm going to go with The Outcast of Redwall. And I was thinking objectively, this is hard because I remember when I first read this book, I really didn't like it. And then when I read it again, I really liked it. So maybe I should have balanced it out a bit more. Maybe 4 is way too high for that, or maybe I should go with my more recent rating and not the one I had as an 8 or 9 year old child. Uh, but anyway, this book is hated, as I mentioned earlier, because of its message that we're sort of fated by our species, and some read that as an analogy to the real world, as something like class or race to be good or bad. But what I found is that even if this book doesn't reach the place that many of us, progressive readers would like us to, it is one of the few books in the series that's philosophical about this at all and even begins to dip into the nuances. And even if the character in question, Vale, isn't nearly as pleasant or good or three-dimensional, whatever you want to say, as we want him to be, there's still a little bit of nuance there. The book doesn't just straight up say this character is evil, even as it challenges us a bit more. But I guess what I really like about this one, so many books in the series just have way too many characters. This book, I could just name you the core main characters. They all serve a particular purpose in the book. So you have Vale, the orphan troubled ferret, Bryony, the mouse at Redwall, who's tasked with guarding Vale. You have Vale's father, Swart Sixclaw, who's kind of the Scarface, like ambitious rising villain. You have Sunflash, the valiant knight badger of a character. You have Scarlath, this wise, totally lovable hawk. And finally, you have the assistant villain, Nightshade, this wise, mystical fox. Number 3 on my list is the very first book, the title book in the series, Redwall. For some, this book is a bit too simple. Matthias isn't the most satisfying protagonist, but this one just works for me because of its simplicity. It's a classic hero's journey. It's kind of a Star Wars like experience in reading it. But I think that simplicity is able to be enjoyable because of its application to this anthropomorphic animal world. One of the weaknesses later in the series is once Brian Jacques gets used to writing about Redwall, he kind of forgets that he's writing about animals. Like, yes, there'll be cultures that the moles have or the badgers have, but in this book, it really matters that they're animals. He plays with their size more, he plays with predator prey relationships more. It allows for different niches on the good to evil spectrum. Number 2 on my list is Salamandra Strawn. So this is a book I actually forgot about from reading it before, and I think basically that's just because unlike some of the other early books in the series, it doesn't get a sequel or a prequel, so it's just easy to lose sight of this one. But this one is one of the closest books in the series to having truly three-dimensional characters, not simply being able to predict how it goes based on the conflict between good and evil. I like how Earthstrike is this noble badger warrior, but he has this genuine tension with his daughter Mara that sort of follows both of them throughout the book. Klitsch, the secondary villain, it's ambiguous if he's still a child or at least a teenager, and so there's this way in which you root for him, despite the fact that he's written in many ways like classic Brian Jacques villains. You have Klitsch's father, Farago the assassin, who's uniquely described as this very charming villain. You get a kind of Heath Ledger vibe to him. You get one of the most memorable hedgehogs in the series in Sprigget. You get one of the most complete shrew plots. Basically, this feels like classic Redwall, but it's the peak of character development, the peak of Brian Jakes coming up with unique ways for characters to be in tension. There's this unique plot point we never see again of a pandemic. Very strong book. And finally, number one in the series, first book I ever read, and turned out to be my most enjoyed on this reread, and that's Martin the Warrior. And that's because it just feels like the most complete Redwall book. It feels like a combination of Peter Pan and that you have these kind of semi whimsical, semi dark journeys on one side, and you have this allegory for real life political revolutions between the sort of non violent and the violent side, and it becoming unclear who wins in the end. And it's also unique in the way that it doesn't really have a happy ending. It's quite challenging thematically for young readers who may pick it up, though it's just subtle enough about that that it's probably not going to bother those young readers and they can appreciate this book again on a reread. And again, in a series where lots of characters are just flat good and evil types, Martin, the most important character in the series, is this fully honorable warrior, yet carrying this unique trauma in all three books about him. I think that makes him a special character, and this fittingly the most special book in the series. So let me know your comments on Brian Jakes's Redwall series. I, had a lot of fun revisiting and appreciating for the first time many parts of these books these past 2 years, really. And I look forward to seeing your thoughts. So that's it for me for now with book reviews and Redwall comments for the foreseeable future. I've been kind of enjoying stepping away from the computer a bit, but I'll be checking in from time to time, enjoying your comments, and who knows, I could change my mind on this and be back tomorrow. I'm the kind of person to turn on a win that way. But whatever it means, see you next time.